Hello, I'm Dr. Jean-Marc Miravalle, and I was asked to do a very short video talking about how to understand when social teachings given by the church pertain to matters of doctrine and when they pertain to matters of prudence. So it's a little complicated in the church because the same people who form the magisterium, namely the Pope and the bishops, are also the leaders. In other words, the same people who are the supreme teachers and who are called to teach us about the timeless truths of faith and morals, or doctrine, are also the supreme shepherds. And they're the ones who are supposed to give us spiritual leadership in attempting to apply the timeless truths of our faith to concrete, practical situations. But while doctrine, again, the timeless truths of faith and morals, is binding on the faithful, in other words, you have to believe it, the prudential decisions which individual members of the hierarchy make, even though it must be respected, is not necessarily binding on the conscience. In other words, you're free to respectfully disagree with it. This becomes, as I said, particularly difficult in the matter of Catholic social teaching, where often doctrinal principles are given very close together with practical and prudential, and therefore not necessarily binding, applications to particular situations. So how do you know, in a given teaching, whether it's a matter of doctrine, which you must believe, or prudential application, which you can respectfully disagree with as a faithful Catholic? Well, the Church gives us basically four things to look for to determine the level of authority of a given teaching. Let's use Pope Francis's reported statement in a recent documentary, which is actually about to come out, that civil unions should be made available to homosexual couples. What should we make of such a statement? Is it doctrinal, timeless teaching, binding on all the faithful, or is it a prudential judgment? Well, the four things we look at are, first of all, how does the Holy Father express himself? What is the phrasing of the statement? Is that highly official and formal? Something like, "We hereby, as successor of Peter, do declare definitively for the entire church"? Or is it informal, almost as though it's expressing a personal opinion? Does he say, "It's always been my view that," or "It's always been my position"? In fact, the wording in the documentary makes it pretty clear that it's an informal discussion, and that Pope Francis is talking about something that has always been his personal position and continues to be his position. So it is not highly formal or official sounding language. The second thing we look for is the setting of the statement. Is this statement found in the canons of an ecumenical council or in an apostolic bull? Is it in the Universal Catechism? Or is it, for instance, in a papal encyclical? These are very high level, very high official settings, documents, statements. Or is it in a very informal setting? Is it in a very non-official setting, like an airplane interview, or the memory of an elderly atheist regarding a private conversation he had with the Holy Father? Or is it in a documentary being issued by a non-Vatican production studio? Because all those latter contexts are highly unofficial. Highly unofficial. And so they would not pertain to doctrine. They would simply be opportunities for the Holy Father to express his personal view. Thirdly, are these statements being made about timeless principles of faith and morals, or simply about prudential applications to a concrete situation? In other words, is the Pope talking about universally binding norms which all the faithful of all times must have held at least implicitly? Or is it simply talking about this particular time and place over here, this particular situation? Because doctrine pertains to timeless principles, and it is there that the magisterium gives us the essential and non-negotiable truths of the faith. But if it has to do with, this is what I think about this situation, about this particular policy, about this particular person, those are all prudential evaluations, prudential assessments, prudential recommendations. And as such, they do not pertain to matters of faith and are not binding on the consciences of all believers. Clearly, in the documentary that's set to come out, the Holy Father is talking about particular policy issues in a particular political, cultural context. He is not talking about something that would apply necessarily to all times and places in the church. And this is clear from the fourth point too, which is frequency. If something pertains to the essential principles of faith and morals, you would expect to see it, at least in some form, in all times and places. There would be a lot of frequency. You would see this statement or its equivalent recurring. That would show that it wasn't simply relative to a particular time and place. It pertains to everywhere that the Catholic faith is found. Now, that's clearly not the case. There is no frequency. Nowhere in the tradition of the Church do you see repeated this idea that homosexual couples should have access to same-sex unions. Good. So these four criteria make it very clear that the Pope's statements pertain to personal prudential judgment, which we must respect, but which faithful people can legitimately disagree with. When it comes to judgment calls, faithful, prudent people may not think the same thing is prudent. That being said, it should be admitted, I think, that there's probably a very good case to be made that something like civil unions should be available to everyone. Certainly not simply homosexual couples, not people who are homosexually active. In other words, we should never reward, in a particular unique way, a radically disordered lifestyle. But if we understand civil unions, as many people do, simply to be a bundling of legal arrangements, whether medical, financial, again, power of attorney, then that bundling might be very useful to make available to anyone. Any pair of people, a brother or sister, close friends, perhaps two people in the same religious community, might find it convenient to be able to bundle, in a very simple way, a lot of legal prerogatives. And if we make such bundles available to everyone, then there's probably no reason to particularly exclude people who are living the particular disorder and sin of a homosexual lifestyle. But again, you're free to disagree, even though, as I said, I think there's a good case to be made that the Holy Father's suggestion would be a prudent one. That being said, even if you respectfully disagree with the Holy Father's prudential judgment, you probably shouldn't make a big fuss of it because it gives the impression of insubordination. But more to the point, you may feel fatigue. And you may have the experience of saying, oh, I wish the Holy Father would not just drop these little statements which can lead to so much confusion, especially when they're dropped in secular contexts without the necessary ecclesiological clarification that might happen in more official or formal documents. You're perfectly within your rights to feel fatigue or disappointment or weariness. But you probably shouldn't indulge in that feeling because, of course, you shouldn't worry so much about someone else's decisions as about your own. We should worry about the decisions that we have control over, not the Vicar of Christ's, whose decisions we don't have control over. And finally, there's a big difference between being weary or fatigued, which, as I said, is legitimate, and freaking out. That's not legitimate. You're allowed to be tired of this sort of thing happening over and over again, but you're not allowed to say, oh no, does this mean that the church, or the rock of Peter on which the church is built, has finally defected officially and universally from the true faith? If you are struggling with that temptation, I would suggest that you pray to God to give you the grace of greater trust in Christ's promises, because He is the one who has guaranteed that neither the church nor the Vicar of Christ who governs it will ever steer us officially, universally, away from the truth of the gospel. Thanks.